The 1990s was a landmark era in film history. The growing trend of blockbuster films, originally coined following the release of Steven Spielberg's Jaws in 1975, continued to dominate the box office through the 1980s, a decade that saw the release of notable war films including Oliver Stone's Platoon, Born on the Fourth of July, and Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. This decade represents a turning point in the film industry, as smaller studios such as Lionsgate, Miramax, and New Line played a pivotal role in the rise of independent cinema, with popular releases such as My Left Foot, Cinema Paradiso, Clerks, and Pulp Fiction. The decade was also notable for its advancements in CGI technology, prominently featured in films such as Jurassic Park and Forrest Gump, as well as the renewed popularity in large epic films such as Braveheart and Titanic. The war film, however, was one film genre that did not benefit from this tumultuous period of transition in Hollywood. With few exceptions, the early to mid 90s was almost completely devoid of big budget war films, particularly those involving a great deal of combat. In fact, the most successful war films of the 90s, prior to 1998, are easier classified as historical dramas that take place during war than war films themselves. Notable examples include Schindler's List and The English Patient. This all changed during 1998 with the release of Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, followed 6 months later by Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line. This afforded critics and fans the rare opportunity of seeing two films dealing with the same conflict and historical background, interpreted by two of Hollywood's most distinguished directors, each possessing wildly different styles. Saving Private Ryan is often lauded as the greatest conventional war film of our generation, while The Thin Red Line is often cited as one of the most unconventional war films ever made. Often referred to as the invisible art, film editing is an artistic element unique to cinema that, when handled by an adept technician, has the ability to engage a viewer to such an extent that the editor's work goes unnoticed. The craft of editing is not simply a matter of stitching together footage in a mechanical fashion, but rather an involved creative process that requires the editor to consider and balance many layers of images, narrative, music, dialogue, and pacing. When executed at a high level, editing also has the ability to divulge underlying themes and intentions that often enrich the viewing experience. Evidence of this can be seen through the analysis of editing techniques found in both Saving Private Ryan and The Thin Red Line. Commonly regarded as one of the masterpieces of classic film editing, the opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan strives to achieve both dramatic emphasis and narrative clarity. The 24-minute sequence viscerally conveys the intended brutality and cost of human life required to take the beaches at Normandy, which is why it remains unsettling to this day. Interestingly, in terms of editing, this opening sequence can be further divided into shorter sections, each with their own distinct narrative function. For analysis, the opening sequence was broken down into roughly 6 sections, each lasting anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, and featuring a specific dramatic purpose. The first section begins while the soldiers wait aboard the landing craft. The purpose of this sequence is to illustrate the quiet intensity of the situation, as well as the unmitigated fear felt by many of the soldiers, which, in turn, is passed on to the audience. We get shots of soldiers praying, throwing up, etc. The second section begins as the soldiers disembark the landing craft and struggle through the water. This sequence communicates a clear sense of helplessness, as soldiers are picked off in droves trying to reach the shore, as well as the surprising and random distribution of death. The third section begins as the soldiers reach the edge of the beach and attempt to advance. The ubiquitous death and bloodshed seen in this sequence further emphasize the looming fear of death, while intensifying the aforementioned helplessness, as the Americans' initial losses and lack of organization suggest the landing has been, so far, an absolute failure. The fourth sequence begins as the soldiers begin their dangerous move to the enemy perimeter and begin gathering forces and weapons. This sequence represents a transition in mood as the first rays of optimism replace the initial feeling of helplessness. Maybe they actually can pull this off. This optimism is then amplified in the fifth sequence as the audience witnesses the competency and teamwork of the platoon for the first time, providing further hope that the pillbox can indeed be taken. The sixth and final sequence begins as the American forces finally capture the pillbox, as well as the entire beach, with the violence and chaos of the American offensive replacing the chaos of the initial sequences. Throughout this opening scene, Spielberg utilizes close-ups to bring an emotional element to the action while quickening the pace to increase tension as the scene moves through each shorter sequence. Only in the last sequence, when the hill is taken, does the pace finally slow down. Contrary to Spielberg's conventional editing style that places a premium on dramatic and narrative emphasis, Terrence Malick's style of editing strives to achieve something very different. While Saving Private Ryan creates narrative tension through questions of who will win the battle, how victory will be achieved, and the human cost of victory, The Thin Red Line opts for a more methodical narrative and editing style that serves as a meditation on life and death, the humanity of the enemy, man's relation to the natural world, and how personal ideologies often supersede the collective mindset inherent to military existence. The scene in which the Americans attempt to storm the hill best exemplifies these traits. To achieve his intended subtextual editing style, Malick moves away from conventional editing techniques like character identification and emphasis on pace to build suspense within a scene. While Saving Private Ryan deals with the central issue of survival of both Ryan and Captain Miller, the heroes, The Thin Red Line seemingly implies these issues to be irrelevant. Humanity within the natural world is more important than humanity transcending the natural world. Through Malick's editing, the audience is unable to discern any notable hierarchy of humans. In fact, the jungles and scenery are given the same significance as the human characters, who are often almost entirely hidden or consumed by their surrounding environment. Malick also places a premium on seemingly menial objects like a flowing stream or sun-drenched hillside as a type of visual poetry, often paralleling or contrasting the narration or context of the scene itself. For example, during the largest action sequence of the film, Malick cuts away from the carnage and barrage of gunfire to show a baby bird struggling to crawl along the forest floor, symbolizing the destructive nature of war and man. Natural energy seeps from every frame of The Thin Red Line, and the audience frequently witnesses instances of combat intercut with pastoral images of the surrounding rainforest. Malick does this to comment not just on war, but humanity in general. Another example of this is seen in The Owl, shown following the death of Private Witt. The owl is a watchful spectator to the horrific violence occurring around it, a spectator to the terror humans afflict upon one another. In conclusion, Saving Private Ryan is a masterful example of conventional film editing, with its distinct chronological direction, three-act structure, and adherence to the logic of cause and effect. The Thin Red Line eschews these techniques in favor of a more meditative, deliberate editing style that forgoes the importance of chronology and narrative in favor of philosophical ruminations into the nature of life itself.